Hello everybody, Geekosaurus Mike here. I'm getting in front of the camera today to talk about something that's probably one of the more stigmatized or stereotyped facets of geek culture, and that is what the general person would know as D&D, or Dungeons and Dragons. If you want to call this a blatant ripoff of Spoonie's Counter Monkeys, go right ahead. This is just my 2 cents. And what I'm here to explain today is kind of what tabletop RPGs are and what people usually think when they think of D&D players. Now, a tabletop RPG is like a mixture. I think of it as a mixture between a board game and a video game, because you have, in essence, you have a story that has been created by your dungeon master or DM or GM, if you want to just call him game master. Usually taking place in some pre-made world like, Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is just the rule system. It's not the actual story. That's what the DM comes up with. And he has this story. He basically makes this world with this quest line, and the players roll up characters who specialize in something. Either they'll be a fighter. They'll have a very high strength stat. They'll have a very high toughness. I don't know if toughness is even a stat in D&D. I've actually never played like legit D&D, but essentially you have stats, and throughout the game you roll against those stats. So probably the easiest one to explain is a game I played called Dark Heresy. It's related to the Warhammer 40k universe, and it's basically the tabletop RPG of that miniature game. In that game, you would have a stat, say, strength. Your stat's anywhere between 1 and 100, and you're trying to roll percentiles, which means dice, 2 d10s, or two 10-sided dice, and try to get under your stat. So if your strength is 50, you're trying to roll 50 or below. That way, there are just phones going off all over the place here. That way, as you get higher, as your stats get higher, there's a better and better chance that you succeed in what you're trying to do. So if you're pursuing these guys, and your dungeon master's like, you follow them into the sewers. It's concrete walls. There's kind of a trickle of water going underneath you. You're running through the sewers. They turn into this opening, and you see one of them in the back press down a plunger. As all of his compatriots get in, there's an explosion, and rubble fills the opening. What do? And you might have the really strong guy, the big fighter guy, go, well, I'm going to try to move the rubble. Okay, that's a strength check. Try to roll your dice, try to roll under 50, and that can either be like, you roll way under 50, you roll like a 5, and you just hoist it over your head like hang clean style, and, you probably wouldn't unplug, all of the rubble doing that, but you succeed. Or generally the more amusing things are when you catastrophically fail. You get you're trying to roll 50 or under, and you get a 99, and the team's like, you yank on it and throw your back out. You'll take this penalty to your speed and this penalty to your strength for X number of days. That's a very simplified version of how the game works. There's a lot more to combat, a lot more to a lot of facets of it, but at its basic core, that's what D&D is. Your DM has created a world, you've created characters that interact with that world. It's very imagination heavy, which is I understand why people don't think very highly of D&D, because a lot of it takes place in the mind, and I can see where one would have difficulty differentiating between playing a tabletop game and playing pretend, like a little kid does. But really you need to think of it as like you're playing a video game. You're not, you're playing Mass Effect 3, you're playing Halo. None of that's real. You're playing pretend on a computer. You're pretending to be a space marine. I'm at a table pretending to be a monk. It's all in how you look at it. I can see where you're coming from. that it looks like just a bunch of people sitting around playing pretend. It's really not. There's a structure, there's a system. It's a game. So at its core, that's kind of what tabletop games are. Now, if I were to ask somebody who doesn't play them, you know, what's the first thing that comes to your head when you think D&D player, you probably think, at least most people I know would think, you know, overweight, sweaty, possible acne, you know, guy who lives in his basement in his 30s, you know, dresses up as an elf once a week and gets around a table with a bunch of other people who dress up like elves and they play pretend in a fantasy world for a while. I'm not saying that guy you're thinking of doesn't exist. I'm sure he does somewhere. I have never met him. I have never played a game with, or met, or even heard of anyone who has even considered dressing up while they play. That's LARPing. That's live action role playing. That's a completely different thing. Honestly, I'm not saying that to say that, you know, they're the freaks, because if it was a good enough group of people, you know, I'd consider it. Like, maybe if it's not, I've heard of some LARPs that are like, we shall hold a meeting at Denny's. They go LARP at, I don't think I could LARP at Denny's. I think I'd have to do it either at someone's house or, you know, at like a park or something, not burst into a public establishment and start yelling about how I'm the dwarf lord under the mountain. But, you know, no, I'm not saying that at all to degrade LARPers. If that's what you enjoy, go for it. I'm saying I've never met that guy who does that for D&D. Now, it's not to say that I haven't met or played with people who don't take it far too seriously. However, you get those people everywhere. You're never truly going to be rid of people who take whatever you're doing far too seriously. And if you're into video games, you know what I'm talking about. You know, you're playing Mario Kart or you're playing Call of Duty, and you've got the guy who's like, his mood for the day, his self-worth depends on, you know, his KD, which is kills to death ratio for those of you who don't play Call of Duty. Or if you don't play video games at all, think fantasy football, fantasy baseball. I've known people who take that stuff, they take that way too seriously to the point that it's like a second job to them. It's like that is their life. They're consumed by how their fantasy team is doing. I've probably met more people who are way too into fantasy leagues than I have who are way too into tabletop games, but that's not the point. If you haven't played any of that, the most basic example I can think of if you're playing backyard sports. Like, you're in your backyard, somebody found like a ball, you decide you're gonna play soccer, you're gonna play basketball, backyard pickup game, you know, just a bunch of guys having fun, and you have that one guy, and you know that one guy, every one of you, that guy, you know who I'm talking about. That guy who treats it like he is in the championship game. Like, you know, he is there and he's playing to win! And he takes the game and he takes himself way too seriously, to the point that, you know, if you're on his team and you mess up, he's going to be legitimately mad at you for the rest of the day. And his view of your worth and his own self-worth depend on how well he plays this backyard game. And, you know, it exists with anything you do. Any kind of, you know, extracurricular thing that you do, you're gonna run into that guy. I don't care if you do theater, I don't care if you play an instrument, I don't care if you play, oh god, what's another example? I always hate trying to come up with a third example, because I can always like come up with two really easily, but I want to do a third one, but I can't think of one. Or I mean, even if you're just playing board games, you're gonna have that one person who takes it way too seriously. But the way that, you know, backyard games and board games kind of differ is that a board game's over in a couple hours. A D&D campaign can take months, really, because you'll meet once a week, but it's months long to get through a whole campaign. And you know, that guy exists, the one who takes it too seriously for tabletop games. And I find that if you're trying to put a group together, there's a fairly easy way to spot who's going to be that guy, because it will always be the same guy. For tabletop games, sorry, I got a tickle in my throat. For tabletop games, you want to look at how that person treats their other interests. If they're a Star Trek fan, and there's nothing wrong with being a Star Trek, there's nothing wrong, if I bring something up as an example, there's nothing wrong with like that, I'm just saying that there's taking it too far. If you know someone who's a Star Trek fan, and they dress in a Starfleet uniform on just a normal day, or they wear the Spock ears, or they like wearing elf ears or like cat ears. Actually, probably the best example, at least the one that I know the most, I've seen the most real life instances of, and this is going to sound bad, look at how that person handles anime. And again, not to say liking anime is bad. There are a few animes I like: Rurouni Kenshin, Trigun, Trinity Blood, Hellsing. Not Hellsing. Yeah, Hellsing. There's nothing wrong with liking them, but there's taking them too far, as I've repeated 1,000 times so far. But, you know, look at how they take anime or or Star Trek or any kind of, you know, interest like that into account. Because the people who are going to take a tabletop game too far are the ones who kind of blur the line between where the anime stops and where the real life begins. And to clarify, that's not to say that, you know, you shouldn't take things away from anime. You should always take something away from every fiction. I mean, Lord of the Rings is about a little person saying a little people can still make, you know, a world-changing difference. That's a great message. That's totally something that you should try to emulate in your life. Now, going back to the anime example, you should probably not try to emulate how the anime character behaves. You should not try to emulate how they talk. You certainly shouldn't try to emulate how they dress, but God knows you have enough people who do that. And I'm doing a lot of clarification. I don't mean like, you know, cosplaying at conventions or something, because there's a point to that. That's kind of what they get together for. I mean, like, if they're the person who kind of tries to incorporate that behavior into their daily lives, that's probably gonna be the person who's gonna take it too far. And it's probably the person who's going to kind of make outside people give you weird looks. And I guess I shouldn't say that you should exclude that person necessarily. Like, if you're friends with them and, you know, they're really gung-ho about being in your campaign, don't be like, no, you'll embarrass us, because that's just a dick move. But just be wary, because that person is the reason people think the things they do about tabletop games. Now, on the flip side, you know, there's also not taking it seriously enough, and there are plenty of people who do that. Like, they do the "it's a game." Their mentality is it's just a game, none of it matters. But they take it to an extreme to where it kind of breaks the game or disrupts how the game should go. And I'll admit, in my first campaign, which was a homebrew Final Fantasy, in my first campaign, I probably didn't take it seriously enough. Actually, me and one of my friends who I hung out with a lot outside of that campaign, we probably didn't take that nearly as seriously as we should have. But then again, we had some people in that group who took it way too seriously, so we were kind of there to go, you know, see, we can have fun. We can chill out a little bit. Oh man, I didn't have to cough all day until I started this video. But there's a balance. There's a balance you need to reach between people who take it way too seriously and people who don't take it seriously enough. Now, I've played in 5 campaigns. Only one of them ever played to completion because we had other things to do with our lives. You know, it's the stereotype thing of the D&D players, they're the forever alone guy, but in most campaigns I've been in, we've had to like call off our meeting in the middle of February because we all had Valentine's Day things to go do with our significant others. So there's that. But I've played in 5 campaigns. 3 of them were the homebrew Final Fantasy, where he took the damage calculations from the video games and put them into a dice rolling setting. I played 1 GURPS campaign. GURPS is a generic universal role-playing system. It's basically designed, it has very broad rules. Not really broad rules, but broad descriptions. It's a rule set that you can apply to any situation you want. If you wanted to do a supernatural campaign, you could use GURPS. If you wanted to do a campaign based on what's that show with the fairy tales, Once Upon a Time, I have no idea how that show works, but I'm sure that with this system you could do, with GURPS, you could do a roleplay of that. Basically, that's supposed to be, you're supposed to be able to conform that to any scenario that you want to make a campaign out of. You can use GURPS with it. That's another thing, now that I'm getting on a wild tangent, is that, you know, you think tabletop games and D&D, you always think of the sword and sorcery medieval setting. It's, you know, it can be anything. There's a game called Spycraft, which is a tabletop game that's kind of like a 007 thing where you're all secret agents, and you can have like a ninja guy who's an infiltrator and a face man and, you know, heavy weapons guy. But there's Spycraft that does that. There's Call of Cthulhu, which there are a couple games of. If you know anything about the Cthulhu mythos, where you play investigators who are kind of trying to stop this occult stuff from happening, and either like, I think it's like, you know, it's like the 20s or the 90s or something, like 1920s, 1990s. And there's the last campaign I played, called Dark Heresy, which takes place in the Warhammer 40k universe, which, if you know nothing about that, think, you know, it's Space Marines like Halo, like the Spartans. It's Space Marines, it's sci-fi. I believe there are books on spaceships, like when you get around to building a ship. But there's that, there's Star Wars, Star Trek, there's a Game of Thrones one, which I was actually somewhat interested in, but the book was like this thick and cost like $80, so no thank you. But yeah, the point is, you know, the D&D tabletop games can be anything. It's all about the story the DM wants to tell. But like I said, the last tabletop RPG that I did as a player was a Dark Heresy campaign, and that, for all its flaws, we kind of went an ass-backwards way of how it was we were a group of mercenaries. Well, for the purposes of this, we were a group of mercenaries who was being hired to track down some rogue space marines who had escaped from a prison. And the DM was the kind of DM who doesn't give you a whole lot of hooks, or doesn't give you a whole lot of leads. He kind of just, you know, says this is where they escaped from and lets you do what you would do to solve it from there. And we kind of went an ass-backwards way about doing that sometimes. There was one point where we thought that we had found an underground weapons dealer who operated out of the basement of this pub. Had like a big steel door, that sliding thing, like what's the password, and things like that. And we had to figure out a way to get in. And so, I mean, it was either me or in the bar while we snuck down. One of us had basically a pistol, so we tried talking our way in once. Didn't work, so we knocked on it again. He slides it open. We just pop it open. We just pop him. A bunch of guards come rushing out, but in rushing out, they unlock the door for us. But where's I even going with this? It can, but despite that that didn't go well after we did that. But despite, you know, all of our bad ideas and things that didn't go well, I think that was the best campaign I've been in as far as the group. Just because we had achieved that balance of none of us took it too terribly seriously. Like, we didn't go overboard with taking it seriously, but we took it seriously enough for it to be enjoyable. And that, in the end, that's what you got to do. You know, if if you come away from this, you know, still thinking, you know, tabletop players are freaks, fine. To each their own. But I'd hope that some of you have watched that thing and gone, oh, okay, I guess they can be normal people. And if you want to try getting into it, find the right group. That's all I'm saying. It varies from person to person. You know, it varies from the guy who doesn't take it seriously at all to, I'm sure, the guy who dresses up as his character exists somewhere. That's really all I've got for you today. I don't know if I'll do any more of these like counter monkey looking things. If by whatever miracle, you know, Spoony, or God help me, Spoonie's fans see this, I know that Spoony does it. It's just my 2 cents. Please don't firebomb my house. Alright, so I'll talk to you guys later.